The millionaire saw the nanny crying while caring for his son and couldn't walk away. The house was steeped in an almost sacred silence. Only the distant tick-tock of the old hallway clock broke the stillness. The warm lights of the foyer elegantly illuminated the polished marble and sculptures that decorated the corners, like guardians of a perfect life, or at least a perfectly staged one. Alexander Whitmore wasn't one to come home early. In fact, he'd built his routine specifically to avoid it. His office, his business trips, his strategically scheduled meetings kept his days busy until nightfall. It was easier that way, more bearable, less real. But that night something made him return earlier. A vague feeling, an unexplained impulse. Upon opening the front door, he didn't expect to find what he found. In the kitchen, barely lit by the dining room lamp, a scene stopped him, as if time had frozen. Sophia, the young nanny who had only been in the house for 2 weeks, held his son Daniel in her arms, cradling him tenderly while singing him a barely whispered lullaby. Her voice trembled, not from the melody, but from the tears silently streaming down her cheeks. She didn't seem to know someone was watching. She didn't seem to care if someone was. Alexander didn't know what to do. Something inside him, dormant for years, stirred. It wasn't just surprise, it was something deeper, a stab in his chest, as if he recognized that pain without fully understanding it. She caressed the sleeping child's hair with a delicacy that can't be learned. Her lips moved in a song that came from far away, from a place where sadness and love intertwine. And in that instant, in that fragile instant, Alexander didn't see an employee. He saw a woman breaking in silence, a woman who, even while crying, never stopped holding on. He wanted to speak, but he didn't. He took a step back and withdrew unseen, but the impact stayed with him, etched, burning. Hours later, in his study, with an untouched whiskey in his hand and his mind still in the kitchen, he understood that something had changed. He couldn't explain it with logic, but he knew it with certainty. He couldn't look at Sophia the same way from now on. And what was more unsettling, he didn't want to walk away from that image. There was something in that contained weeping that drew him in. Maybe it was the way she held Daniel, or the way her voice broke without stopping. Maybe it was the loneliness he recognized in her eyes, a loneliness that asked for nothing, but screamed. And you who are listening to this story, hasn't something like this ever happened to you? Seeing someone cry, and feeling like you can't go on with your life as if nothing happened? Then subscribe now, because this story has barely begun. The Whitmore mansion, with its antique glass windows and perfectly manicured gardens, had been designed for family life. Every corner spoke of the promise of happiness once possible. The empty swing in the corner of the garden, the room decorated with phosphorescent stars, the library where no one read aloud anymore. But all of that stopped when Claire died. Alexander's wife, the only woman he had ever allowed into his storms. An absurd accident, a cloudy dawn, a phone call that split his life in two. Since then, the house became a sanctuary of routine, of control, of silence. He hired the best governesses, cooks and domestic staff, but none stayed too long, not because of mistreatment. Alexander wasn't cruel, he was just absent as a father can be without abandoning, as cold as the marble he walked on every morning. With Daniel, his little son, things were even more complicated. He loved him, of course, in his own way, but seeing him meant remembering Claire. It meant facing what was no longer there, what he couldn't save. So over time, he delegated, he paid, he protected from a distance. That's why when Sister Margaret, an old acquaintance of his mother's, told him about a young woman who urgently needed work, Alexander barely looked up from his laptop and agreed. "As long as she knows how to take care of my son, she'll be fine," he said, and he didn't ask any more questions. Sophia arrived on a rainy morning, without luggage, just a worn backpack and a coat too thin for the March cold. She had a pale face, downcast eyes, and a politeness that seemed learned by force. She didn't question rules, she didn't ask for conditions, she just nodded and got to work. In the first few days, Alexander barely noticed her presence. She moved in silence, she played with Daniel, prepared his snacks, organized his clothes with an almost maternal dedication. The boy seemed to grow fond of her with a speed that made him uncomfortable. Sometimes, he heard him laugh in a way he hadn't heard in his own house for years. And yet there was something about Sophia that didn't quite fit, a sadness she didn't show, but that overflowed when she believed she wasn't being seen, something that couldn't be explained by fatigue or melancholy. One night, passing by the half-open door of the playroom, Alexander heard her humming a strange, ancient melody. It wasn't a children's song, it was almost a prayer, a plea. And although he didn't understand it, something in that song stirred his soul. It was then that, for the first time in a long while, Alexander left his study before midnight. He poured himself a glass of wine and sat in the main living room for no apparent reason. The house, so perfect on the outside, so photogenic, felt hollow, like him. And for the first time in years, he allowed himself to admit it. Sophia wasn't like the others, and whatever he had seen that night in the kitchen was just the tip of something deeper, darker, more human. Sophia walked through the hallways like a kind shadow, always with her shoulders slightly hunched, as if apologizing for taking up space. She moved with the precision of someone who had learned that making mistakes has consequences, and never did she look anyone in the eyes for more than a few seconds, not even Daniel. It was strange, because the boy seemed to adore her. He sought her out to show his drawings, asked her to stay when he had nightmares, offered her his toys with that instinctive generosity children have when they feel trust. But she, although she responded with tenderness, always maintained a certain invisible distance, a kind of inner boundary that no one crossed. Alexander began to observe her without meaning to, first from the upstairs railing, then from the study window. He watched her play with his son on the lawn, teach him to read simple words, comb his hair with hypnotic patience. Each of her gestures was measured, contained, as if she feared breaking something if she gave herself completely. But it was in the moments of rest, when she thought she was alone, where Sophia revealed a different version of herself. One afternoon, Alexander stopped when he saw that she had gone out to the garden after putting Daniel to bed. She was sitting on the stone bench, with her head in her hands. She wasn't crying, but her whole body seemed tired, not physically, but as if her soul carried too much weight. Her eyes were closed, and her lips moved as if she were praying or talking to someone who was no longer there. Another night, returning from a business dinner, Alexander passed by the kitchen in shadows and found her there, standing in front of the window. She hadn't noticed his presence. She held a cup with both hands, but wasn't drinking. She just looked out into the garden's darkness. She was still, so still she seemed like a forgotten painting. And then he saw it, a small tremor in her lips, a tear descending without permission, a contained expression, broken only by a sigh. It was that image that haunted him for days. It wasn't common for him to get involved with employees. He maintained his boundaries with surgical precision, but there was something about Sophia that disrupted his certainties, a crack in his system, a presence as silent as it was impossible to ignore. He asked the housekeeper for a report on her. He found nothing strange, just vague data. She had been recommended by a nun, had no close family, no previous references. She had lived in different places in a short time, but everything seemed in order, too much in order, as if everything about her was designed to go unnoticed. And still, there she was, in his house, in his garden, in his son's dreams, and now slowly, in his thoughts.
Alexander didn't know what it was, or what he was looking for. He only knew that each day it became harder not to see her, and that in that silent watching there was something urgent, as if, without knowing it, she was asking for help, without daring to ask for it. Sophia had a very peculiar way of being sad. She didn't make noise, she didn't break things, she didn't scream or lock herself away. She just slowly fell apart, like a dry leaf falling without casting a shadow. There was something almost poetic in her way of breaking, a sadness that didn't ask for comfort, that only existed as a constant whisper behind her steps, as if her heart had grown accustomed to bleeding in secret. Alexander understood it more than he liked to admit. For years he too had lived like that, functional, polite, correct, and absolutely broken inside. He knew what it was like to wake up with a tight chest and still say good morning. He knew what it was like to pass in front of the mirror without recognizing himself. That's why, perhaps, Sophia's presence touched him so much, because it was like seeing himself, before hardening completely. The difference was that she still cried.
One afternoon, while pretending to read reports in his study, Alexander heard quick, soft steps in the hallway. He got up without thinking and went out. Sophia had gone to the service bathroom, believing she was alone. She left the door slightly open. Alexander, passing by, heard a brief sob. Nothing more, just an instant, as if the weeping had escaped without permission and then had hidden again. He didn't want to invade, but something inside him broke. After that, he began to notice other things. Small details, scars on her wrists, barely visible. A slight tremor in her hands when phones rang. Her way of startling at loud noises, her lost gaze when she thought no one was watching. The woman who took care of his son with such tenderness lived trapped somewhere within herself, and that hurt him. It hurt him more than it should have. One night he dared to ask her, while she folded laundry in the utility room, "Is everything all right, Sophia?" She looked up for an instant, forced a smile, and responded in a soft voice, "Yes, sir, thank you for asking." But her eyes said something else. They said, "Don't ask more, I'm not ready." Alexander didn't insist, but that night he couldn't sleep. He walked through the house like a ghost, reviewing every gesture, every look, every shared silence, and he asked himself something he didn't know if he wanted to answer. What hides behind the pain that no one tells? And you who are here listening, have you ever seen someone pretend to be okay, while inside they were crumbling into 1,000 pieces? Leave your comment. Tell me if you ever felt that someone very close to you simply didn't know how to ask for help, because there are pains that don't scream, they only cry in silence. From that night on, something had changed between them. Sophia continued being the same, punctual, silent, dedicated. She didn't overstep boundaries, didn't show affection beyond what was appropriate, didn't complain. But every time their eyes met, something happened. A second of mute electricity, a connection made of wounds that hadn't yet been named. Alexander, for his part, became increasingly less indifferent. He tried to convince himself it was paternal concern, that he only cared because she was taking care of his son. But deep down he knew that was an excuse. He had begun to wonder what Sophia dreamed when she got lost staring out the window. What made her shudder at night? What story she hid behind that fragile composure? He tried to start conversations more than once. He offered her a cup of coffee. He asked if she liked books. He even stayed a couple of times in the garden while she played with Daniel. But he always got the same response: a slight polite smile and a respectful retreat. It was as if she knew that crossing certain lines could cost her dearly. And yet one night, when Daniel was already asleep, and the rain beat against the windows like desperate fingers, something different happened. Alexander came down for a glass of water and found her in the dining room, picking up the boy's toys. He stopped seeing her from behind, her damp hair falling down her neck, her trembling fingers holding a stuffed giraffe. "Sophia," he said in a low voice. She turned, startled. The dim light made her seem even smaller. She immediately looked down. "Sorry, I didn't know you'd come down. I'm just picking up. You don't have to apologize." Silence. "Would you like some tea?" She hesitated. "A lot," then nodded. They shared it in the kitchen, sitting across from each other. Two strangers with too many stories on their skin. Alexander tried not to stare too much, but couldn't help it. There was something in her expression that disarmed him. "Are you comfortable here?" he asked. Sophia nodded. "Daniel is a very sweet boy, and you're good with him." She smiled, but that smile didn't reach her eyes. They talked little, about simple things, about what the boy liked to eat, about a book he had left on the table, about spring storms. And yet, there was an invisible tension between each word, as if they both knew that what was truly important was in what wasn't being said. When they said goodbye, something remained suspended in the air, like an unmade promise, like a half-built bridge. That night, Alexander went up to his room with an uncomfortable certainty. Sophia wasn't well, and the worst part was that he didn't know how to help her without scaring her more. And what he didn't yet know was that getting close to her would have consequences that would change his life forever. It was a morning like any other. The sky dawned overcast, with that grayish light that makes everything quieter. Sophia had gone out early with Daniel to the nearby park, as they usually did on Tuesdays. The housekeeper took advantage to clean the rooms more calmly. Alexander, for his part, stayed working from his home office.
more distracted than usual, reviewing documents that couldn't hold his attention, until he received a message, something administrative, an issue related to staff payments. He asked the housekeeper to bring him the corresponding service area folder, but when he opened it, an envelope fell to the floor. It wasn't labeled, it had no mark, no sender, just a name written by hand in clumsy handwriting. Alexander wasn't a naturally curious man. He preferred discretion, but something about that envelope disturbed him. It wasn't part of the normal records, and it was inside Sophia's folder. He hesitated for a few seconds, and opened it. Inside, a folded sheet, a certificate, a full name, a medical record, an address in another city, a hospital admission date, and a brief note, unsigned. "If I disappear again, let someone know it wasn't by choice." His stomach tensed. He didn't understand everything, but he understood enough to know that what was in that envelope wasn't normal. He stored it carefully, without saying anything. But from that moment, uneasiness stuck to his body, like a chill that wouldn't shake off. Who was Angel? Why did Sophia have that document hidden? What did she mean by disappearing? When she returned from the park with Daniel, she seemed normal, slightly paler perhaps, a bit agitated, but she smiled tenderly at the boy, as if nothing had happened. Alexander observed her for the rest of the day, looking for some sign, some carelessness, something that would tell him if she was in danger, or if he had already crossed a line he shouldn't have crossed. That night he couldn't fall asleep. He sat in front of the unlit fireplace and read the note again. The final phrase kept spinning in his head. Let someone know it wasn't by choice. Who writes something like that? Who leaves a message like that in an envelope, inside a house where they're trying to seem invisible? Sophia was running from something or someone. That was clear, and now he knew it. He could have ignored it. He could have talked to his lawyer, dismissed her with a generous severance, made sure the boy wasn't affected, do what he always did, close his heart, cover the risk, and move on. But he couldn't, because no matter how much he wanted to convince himself that she was just an employee, the truth was that, without knowing how, Sophia already inhabited a place in his life that couldn't be vacated so easily. It was a Thursday just past 6 in the evening, when Sophia's world began to wobble again.
Alexander was in his study, reviewing an investment proposal, when he heard a sharp knock on the service door. It wasn't a doorbell. It was a fist, strong, persistent. The housekeeper wasn't there and Daniel was playing in the living room with his wooden blocks. Alexander went to open it, suspicious. Before arriving, he heard Sophia's hurried steps from the hallway. Her face had lost all color. Her eyes were wide open, as if she had just seen a ghost. "Don't open it. Please, don't open it," she whispered, placing herself between him and the door, breathing heavily. "What's wrong?" asked Alexander, without moving. But she shook her head. She didn't explain anything. She just pleaded silently, with desperation trembling in her voice. The knock sounded again, 3 times, then a thick silence, and finally, a man's voice. "I know you're there, Sophia. You won't hide forever." Alexander felt the cold run down his spine, not because of the man behind the door, but because of the expression of pure panic on her face. "Go upstairs with Daniel," he ordered firmly. Now, she didn't move. "Do it, Sophia." Then she obeyed, almost without walking, as if her body weighed tons. Alexander waited a minute before opening, but there was no one there, just a letter on the ground, no sender, addressed to her. He didn't read it, but he saw her reaction when he handed it to her. Sophia collapsed on the carpet, hugging the letter without opening it, as if it were a death sentence. Later that night, when the house slept, it was she who knocked on the study door. "I want to resign," she said, with her voice barely audible. "No, I can't put you in danger. You're no longer safe with me here. Explain to me," Alexander asked, approaching. But Sophia just closed her eyes, as if explaining it was even more painful than living it. "Is it because of Angel?" She froze. "Where did you hear that name?" He didn't answer. He just sat in front of her. The silence was thick, full of unspoken truths. "I'm not a criminal," she said finally. "I just tried to protect myself. I just wanted him not to find me. But he always does." "Who is he?" "My husband. Legally he still is, although it's been years since I belonged to him." There were the words Alexander didn't expect, that he didn't want to hear, but that explained everything. A dangerous man, a past that still pursued her, a story of flight that she never wanted to tell, but that now seeped through the cracks of her carefully ordered life. And he, what could he do? Alexander felt something inside him activate. It was no longer just compassion or tenderness. It was rage, a deep need to protect her, not to allow her to disappear again, not to allow that man to take her away, even if it was out of fear. And if you too have ever felt that urgency to care for someone more than you care for yourself, like this story now. Because in that moment, in that living room, Alexander understood that he could no longer look the other way. The next day, Alexander got up before dawn. He hadn't slept. He had spent the previous night reviewing over and over again that envelope, that letter, and Sophia's trembling face in the study's shadows. There was something about her that not only asked for help, but also protection against a system that hadn't been on her side. After making sure Daniel was still sleeping, he took his phone and called his trusted lawyer. He didn't reveal names. He just asked for a confidential consultation, a sensitive situation, something that required caution. Later, he personally went to a discreet police station on the outskirts of the city. He showed the document he had found, the note. He asked if there was any report, any complaint linked to Sophia. What he got was an answer that left him cold. Sophia was registered as a person with a record for voluntary disappearance. There was no active complaint against her husband, no follow-up, no restraining order. For the law, she had simply fled, and he, her husband, remained legally her closest contact. Without direct evidence of violence, said the officer, there's not much we can do. And the letter, the harassment, the threats, it could be anything. Unless the victim comes and formally reports it, it's out of our hands. Sophia wasn't going to do it. That was clear. She didn't trust anyone. She didn't trust justice. She didn't trust herself. And it wasn't hard to understand why. Back home, he found her in the kitchen, washing dishes, as if nothing had happened. But her eyes were those of someone who had already resigned themselves. Sophia, he said, if you're in danger, I want to help you. She left the plate in the sink and looked at him. No one can help me. I can. You don't know what you're getting into. Then tell me, let me in. For a second, Alexander thought she was going to speak, that she would finally break that internal dam. But then they heard the sound of the doorbell. Sophia's heart stopped. It wasn't a knock. It wasn't a letter under the door. It was the doorbell, the real one, the one guests used. Alexander was the one who approached this time. An elegant envelope on the doormat, thick paper, no sender. Again, inside, a photograph, her, Sophia, with Daniel in her arms, at the park, taken from a distance. Alexander felt a dry cold in his chest. It wasn't just harassment, it was surveillance, it was a threat. He showed her the image. She took it with trembling hands, and immediately tore it up. Why don't you do anything? He asked. Because the last time I did, I ended up in the hospital, and he went free, and there was the truth, clear, raw, filthy. The law didn't protect her, justice didn't see her, but Alexander did, and sometimes, just sometimes, seeing is enough to decide to risk everything. Alexander wasn't impulsive. Every decision in his life had been calculated, measured, protected by a shield of logic and emotional distance. But that morning, seeing the paralyzing fear on Sophia's face, he knew he could no longer hide behind his rule. He didn't ask permission. He didn't elaborate a perfect plan. He just acted. He packed a suitcase with the essentials for him and his son. He asked Sophia to do the same, although she barely managed to pack a couple of changes of clothes and an old notebook, with trembling hands. When she asked where they were going, he answered calmly, to a place where no one will find you, at least for now. She didn't argue. She didn't ask more questions. She let herself be guided. They left through the back door, in a different car than usual. They avoided cameras, direct routes, and turned on phones. They drove for hours to a house no one knew about, that he had bought years ago in a remote corner of the countryside, surrounded by tall trees, with no neighbors nearby, no digital traces. Upon arriving, Sophia got out in silence. Daniel ran to the garden without fully understanding the reason for the surprise trip. And Alexander watched her, standing on the porch, as if he were seeing someone who had just emerged from a war. Here you'll be safe.
he said. Sophia looked at him, with silent tears in her eyes. She didn't say thank you. She couldn't. The word felt too small. That night, they had dinner together, the three of them, like an improvised family, marked by fear but united by an inexplicable tenderness. The fireplace fire illuminated their faces with a warmth that none of them remembered feeling in a long time. When Daniel fell asleep on the sofa, curled up among cushions, Sophia covered him with a blanket and stood watching him in silence. Alexander sat beside her. He didn't touch her. He didn't say anything. He just looked at her. "You didn't have to do this," she whispered finally. "Yes, yes, I did." She looked at him as if she didn't understand. "I'm not your responsibility. I'm not doing it for that." Silence. "Then why?" And there, for the first time, Alexander let his guard down. "Because when I saw you that night, crying with my son in your arms, I felt something I didn't know I still had. And I don't want to lose it." The words floated in the air like unplanned confessions. Sophia didn't respond, but her hand, timidly, approached his. She didn't take it. She just brushed it. Barely a second, barely a spark, but it was enough, because sometimes when two broken souls meet, they don't need promises, just a firm presence, a shared silence, a flame lit in the midst of chaos. And in that instant, Alexander knew it with absolute certainty. He couldn't walk away from her. He didn't want to. He shouldn't. Dawn fell thick and warm over the refuge. The trees creaked with the gentle wind, and inside the house, only the slight crackling of wood consuming in the fireplace could be heard.
Sophia couldn't sleep. After putting Daniel to bed, cleaning up the dinner remains, and trying to read a page unsuccessfully, she sat on the carpet, in front of the fire, wrapped in a blanket. The silence was too strong. The kind of silence that forces you to look inward, even if it hurts. Alexander found her there, minutes later, also sleepless, also carrying something he no longer wanted to hide. "Do you mind if I stay for a while?" he asked. She shook her head, without speaking. He sat beside her. Neither looked at the other at first. They just shared the warmth of the fire, and each other's. "You're afraid all the time, aren't you?" he said. Finally, Sophia closed her eyes. "It's not fear, it's knowing that everything can break at any moment, and having lived enough to understand that you can't prevent it. Do you want to tell me?" She breathed deeply, very deeply. And then she began. "Angel wasn't like that at first. He made me laugh. He made me feel seen. When I got pregnant, I thought my life was finally going to change, that I was going to have a home, a family. But after a few months, he began to control me. First it was jealousy, then shouting, then hitting, and then he took everything from me. And the baby, it was never born. I was 6 months pregnant when he pushed me against a table. He said it was an accident. The hospital didn't believe it, but they didn't do anything." Alexander felt a knot rise from his chest to his throat. Sophia continued speaking, with her broken voice. "I escaped. I slept in stations, churches, abandoned houses. I changed my name. I worked where no one asked too many questions, but he always finds me. Always." Tears were flowing now, open, without fear, without barriers. "I thought I would never trust a man again, or anyone, until I saw how you look at your son, how you listen to him, how you respect him, even in his silence." She looked at him finally, directly, without masks, and that made me want to stay, even though I don't know if I deserve to stay. Alexander held her with his gaze, and then he spoke. "I also lost. I lost Claire, my wife, in a stupid accident. We were going to a dinner. We argued in the car. I got out to clear my head," she continued, "and didn't come back. I lived for years convinced it was my fault, that if I had stayed quiet, if I hadn't argued, she would be alive." Silence. "I locked myself in a world of marble, numbers, schedules. I stopped looking at Daniel. I stopped looking at life. And now I see you. And I swear I don't want to close my eyes again." The words didn't need more adornment. She came closer. She rested her head on his shoulder, and for the first time, they allowed themselves to cry together, not out of weakness, but because sometimes the soul needs to cry to be able to love again. The following days at the refuge were different, not because of what they did, continuing with a simple routine, cooking, caring for Daniel, reading in the afternoons, but because of how they did it. There was something new in Sophia, a serenity that didn't come from the absence of fear, but from the presence of love. Small, silent, still unnamed, but real. Alexander noticed it in the way she smiled at the boy, in how she held his gaze, in how she began to raise her voice, without asking permission. As if finally, she remembered that she also had the right to take up space. One morning, while they were collecting firewood, she stopped. "I want to report him," she said. Alexander turned, without being surprised. "Are you sure?" She nodded. "I don't want to live in fear anymore. I want him to pay for what he did. I don't want to keep hiding all my life." Alexander didn't respond with words. He just extended his hand. She took it, and for the first time, it didn't tremble. They returned to the city with a plan, with legal support, with evidence, with witnesses. Alexander took care of speaking with the nun, who had protected her in her flight, with doctors who treated her injuries, with former neighbors who knew what happened behind those walls. The system didn't make it easy for them. They doubted, they interrogated her, they re-victimized her, but she didn't break. She looked at him, and that was enough. On the day of the preliminary hearing, Angel appeared in the courtroom with the same arrogance as always. He smiled when he saw her, like someone who believes they have control. But what he found wasn't the scared girl who once escaped. It was a firm woman who didn't lower her gaze, who told her story without stuttering, who for the first time spoke her truth out loud. Alexander was there the whole time, sitting in the back, without intervening, but with his gaze fixed on her, like a lighthouse, like a home. The judge ordered a formal investigation and an immediate restraining order. Sophia left that courthouse not with a definitive victory, but with something she had never had, a beginning of justice. When they came out, the sky was overcast, but it wasn't raining. She breathed deeply and looked up at the sky. "I haven't felt like this in years," she said. "Free and brave," he added. "More than you think." She looked at him and smiled at him, a true smile, one of those that are born from the center of the chest. They didn't need to say it yet. There was no need for titles, promises, or hasty vows. It was enough to know that now they walked together, and that the worst was behind them. Weeks passed since that hearing. Angel didn't appear again. The investigation advanced slowly, but for the first time, silence wasn't synonymous with threat. It was peace, it was respite. Life in the house changed. Sophia no longer moved like a whisper. She laughed with Daniel at breakfast, cooked with music, dared to leave her hair loose and walk barefoot through the living room, without feeling out of place. Alexander, for his part, became a warm presence. He no longer hid behind contracts or schedules. He allowed himself to be, to listen, to feel. One ordinary afternoon, Daniel ran toward Sophia with a sheet of paper. "Look, it's us," he shouted with pride. In the drawing, 3 figures held hands under a giant sun, a tall man, a woman with long hair, and a boy with a huge smile. Sophia stared at the sheet for a long time. Then she looked up at Alexander, who was watching her from the doorway. She didn't say anything. She just approached, and finally, hugged him. But it wasn't a timid, broken hug. It was a full hug, with closed eyes, with surrendered bodies, like someone who finds, at last, a place to stay. Alexander surrounded her with his arms and rested his cheek on her head. "You're trembling," he whispered. "No, not now," she replied. "It's the first time in years I'm not afraid." They stayed like that for a long time, as if time owed them that moment, as if the world could stop just so they could breathe. That night, Daniel fell asleep on the sofa again, but this time, Alexander carried him in his arms to his bed, and when he returned, he found Sophia in the kitchen, preparing tea for both of them. "Do you know what I thought today?" she said, without looking at him. "That I never imagined life would give me a second chance, and I never imagined that someone could teach me to feel again." They looked at each other, and nothing more was needed. The kiss came like an ancient caress, like something that was already written before they met. It wasn't urgent, it was deep, soft, true. And there in the middle of that kitchen, with the world in silence and the past closed like a book read to the end, it was known 2 broken souls can not only love each other, they can rebuild themselves, together. If you made it this far, if this story touched your heart, like it did theirs, subscribe right now, because there are stories that remind us that even the darkest pain can transform into love when someone decides to stay.